Hey guys, how's it going? The last few videos have been much more on the long side, so I'm gonna try to keep this one a bit more bite-sized. I'm still sick because
I have a weak immune system,
and I don't really feel like talking for the rest of eternity. So make sure to hit the subscribe button to join our little art community, and let's jump into it. For this week's scene studies, I decided to explore the theme of architecture. I'm not very good at drawing and designing buildings. I really struggle with perspective, so I figured this would be a little bit more of a challenge and would hopefully help me improve my architecture skills. Duh. In my visual development class on Schoolism, I've been doing these perspective assignments where basically you take a reference photo, you trace over it with lines to be able to get the perspective down. You find your horizon line, find your vanishing points, all that jazz. And then you remove the reference photo, and then you draw the scene, and then you change the perspective of that scene. So if you started in 1-point perspective, you would also do it in 2-point perspective. And you do that 3 or 4 different times, and each time you change the perspective of it, and let me tell you, I feel like I actually kind of understand perspective a little bit better now. Thank you, Victoria Ying. She explained that even though you have, for 2-point perspective, the idea is that you have 2 vanishing points. However, Victoria explained that if you have different objects in the scene at different angles, those different objects will have different vanishing points. My mind was blown because for years now I've been so confused about perspective because I'm sorry, these objects don't fit into this scene. If I try to make them vanish to this point, everything looks stiff and weird and wonky. And now I understand the universe, so I know everything there is to know about art now. I'm just kidding, I really don't. I have much more to learn, but I digress. I feel like I understand something now. Pro tip though, all of those vanishing points are still on the same horizon line. They have to be on the same horizon line. All the objects don't have to vanish to the same points, but they have to have their vanishing point on the horizon line. Anyways, let's continue. So the first architecture study I decided to do was Rapunzel's Tower from Tangled. The sketch was pretty simple as the foreground plants are very basic shapes. I did not realize how intricate Rapunzel's Tower is designed though. I've been reading The Art of Tangled, which I got for Christmas.
Thank you, Mom and Dad.
It was really interesting learning how they did the shape language for her tower and everything. Oh my gosh, I'm dying. So there's a lot of detailing in the top of her towers, different windows that are coming out at different angles. There's different spires that I never knew were there. So yeah, that was really interesting to see when I started looking at the reference photo. So I started off with the wet on wet technique. I am determined to learn how to use this technique properly, and I feel like this week's studies really helped improve that a lot for me. I feel like I'm kind of understanding how to do it now. That being said, there's a long way to go. I really enjoyed painting the greenery on and around the base of the tower. Also, there's a little patch of light in the grass at the base of the tower, which was way too much fun. It's not quite so strong in the reference photo, but I care not. That was just a little bit of a special touch from me, going in a little bit heavy-handed on the yellowish green. I like that. I like light. I think light's pretty cool. I really tried to simplify the leaf shapes in the foreground greenery and kind of pick them out of the shadows. I didn't want to distract from the architecture, so I basically just blocked in the greenery in a very, very dark green bordering on black in some areas, and then kind of picked out a few leaf shapes around the edges to give it a little bit more form. So next up is Minas Tirith from The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. I know I talked in the last video about how much I love Lord of the Rings, and oh my goodness, doing this painting, I need to watch the movies again. I cannot find them for the life of me though. So this sketch was a little bit of a hassle to do. There's a lot of details in the structure. And I had to get a snack for this one because the brain power that it took to sketch this out was just too much for me. I had to simplify as best I could because there are so many like intricate details in the city. And I was like, I am going to die if I try to paint all of these. So anyways, moving on. So I really liked the reference photo for this one. There's a very obvious light and dark side, as well as a cool and a warm side. There was a lot of opportunity to simplify the lighting and block in some pretty basic shapes. Also, I liked the horse. So you'll probably notice that I use a medium-sized flat brush for the majority of this piece, and I only go in with a small round brush towards the end. This was really just to help me stay loose with the painting in the early stages and get in those big basic shapes first and not worry about all of the little details, especially the details in the foreground that are really pretty minor. The scene is not about the wheat-colored plants in the foreground. I don't need to paint every single strand of plant life to get the point across that you are indeed looking at plants. Our eyes actually do this in everyday life. So if you're looking at a tree, your eyes aren't focusing on every single leaf. It's kind of grouping it together. Your eyes are grouping the tree together into basic shapes. You're only looking at one thing at a time, and the rest of it kind of just gets a little clumpy. So for the next study, I decided to do the Owl Witch's house from Song of the Sea. Shout out to Lauren for the movie suggestion. I switched things up for this painting and I decided to do a different border size. The house would have been severely smushed or like partially cut out had I kept to the size I'd been doing for most of the other scene studies. So I decided to go a little bit bigger and change the dimensions of the border. This is, hands down, my favorite scene study thus far. I really took my time with the sketch for this one because there's a lot of little rocks and beams and I really wanted to do them justice. This painting took significantly longer than the others, which I knew it would, so I kind of planned my week around that and was like, okay, which day am I going to paint this because it's going to take me all day to do. One of the things that I really love about Cartoon Saloon movies is the immense amount of textures in the backgrounds. There's a lot of little graphic elements that are really interesting. So going into this piece, I set a goal to replicate the texture as best I could. There are so many fun design elements in the clouds. I think they're clouds. Are those clouds? Kind of creepy clouds, but clouds. We're gonna call them clouds. For the sake of the video, they're clouds. So anyways, lots of design elements in the clouds, on the rocks, and in the mountains. The rocks actually have little faces with mustaches on some of them, which is awesome. I went in with straight up black to block in the shapes of the sky and the ground. I then used wet on wet, what a shock, to color the mountains and try to get in those more textural, kind of watercolor elements. They do watercolor backgrounds, I'm pretty sure, for most of their Irish folklore movies, which is insanely cool. I'm not gonna lie, if I made a pie chart for how long each thing took me to do for this painting, I think the rocks would take up probably a good 75, I'm gonna say 76.2% of that pie chart. Those rocks took me forever between sketching and then getting the local colors down, sitting there just looking at the reference photo and going, wait, where is this rock? What is this one? What color is this? So yeah. And then the detailing later on took a while. Anyways, we're not there yet. I really love the pop of red for Ben's cloak. It's a nice secondary focal point for of the scene. Even though there's a character in the scene, the prominent feature is still very much the house. I realized that the beams on the right-hand side aren't quite as they are in the reference, but that's how it goes sometimes, and by the time I'd started painting, I was like, you know what? It's gonna be okay. So as I'm painting the house, I start with the shadows and then paint the kind of tannish local color. I was really happy with the tan, but I realized that the shadow just wasn't dark enough and that I needed to repaint it. I've been learning that a lot of times I have to see things on the page in the context of the things around it to determine whether it's right or not. Whether it's the right shape or the right color, you name it. Realizing this little trait about myself has also changed how I use my mixing palette. For a while, I was kind of embarrassed about how messy my palettes are. Like, there's literally just paint everywhere. But over the last couple of weeks, I've realized that it's a very organized chaos. It makes sense to my brain. So if I start a painting with a clean palette, I get pretty nervous about mixing the colors because I have nothing to go off of. It's just starting straight from the tube. But if I have paints already on the palette, even if they're kind of muddy, being able to mix those in, for one, gives it more of like a natural look because it helps desaturate the colors a little bit, but it also just helps give me kind of a reference point to go off of. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense. I'm sorry. I think it's really important that you find your process for drawing and painting, really taking the time to ask yourself, what works for me? You know, this takes a lot of time and lots of paintings to figure out your process, but I think once you do, it makes it a lot more enjoyable. So this is my favorite painting out of all the scene studies so far. But unfortunately, about an hour away from the end of this one, just when I was getting to those really cool design elements that I was talking about in the clouds and the trees and the rocks, my phone was like,
Hey, I'm dying. Also, you're out of storage space.
And I was like,
Well, freaking...
So that was incredibly frustrating, but I decided to go ahead and finish the painting because what are you gonna do? It's disappointing, I know, but that's life. So next up is Gracie Manor from Disney's Haunted Mansion. I'm gonna be honest, I wasn't really feeling it with this one. It's not like I'm not happy with how it turned out, and it's not like I didn't enjoy any of the process. I just wasn't super in the mood to paint that day. That happens sometimes, but it was day 4 and I did not want to give up one day before the end of the work week, so I trudged on. Like I said earlier, I'm not great with architectural elements, so the sketch was quite a hassle. The manor ended up being a little bit cockeyed and you know, she's a little crooked, but it's okay, you know. It adds some character. Oh, hey, look, I'm going in wet on wet again. What a shock. I've discovered that I really like doing wet on wet for the backgrounds of these studies, but not so much for the focal element. The wet on wet helps me not over-render the less important elements, but trying to start wet on wet for my main focal point can sometimes end up looking very muddy for me. I really enjoyed playing around with the colors in the house. Adding some blues and reds, and even a few kind of peachy oranges here and there. I've been watching a lot of Marco Bucci's videos on color, and I really love his use of color vibration. I've been learning how to play all over the color spectrum by shifting through grays. Like I said, I wasn't really feeling it this day, but overall, I'm not upset with how it turned out. So let's move on. The last scene I decided to do was this incredibly beautiful background from Spirited Away. So in this scene, Chihiro's looking out across the water at the Spirit City. I love studying Studio Ghibli backgrounds.
Backgrounds.
Wow. gosh, I think I'm hysterical. Anyways, I really love studying Studio Ghibli backgrounds as they're very painterly and borderline kind of impressionistic in some cases. This scene in particular has very impressionistic elements around the boat, the ferry. The lights are very simplified and painterly. You guys are gonna get real tired of me saying this, but I went in wet on wet for the background. Oh, gosh, I can't stop saying that. But I went in wet on wet for the sky. Surprisingly, I went in pretty thick on the sky as I realized that I hadn't gotten dark enough for the first pass. Once again, I didn't really notice that the sky wasn't dark enough until I started painting the city beneath it. I liked the look of it, but I needed the context of the city to tell me to go darker. It was super fun painting all of the little details of the stores. I knew I was gonna go ham with the details, so I switched the camera angles so I wouldn't hit my head on the camera, as I so often do, and block your view of the painting. Painting the reflections in the water was probably one of the biggest challenges of this painting. Water changes how things look, and I just don't understand how exactly it works, so that's probably a sign that I need to study it more. The more studies I do, the more things I learn, but the more things I discover that I need to learn. Surprisingly, this is my first Spirited Away study for this challenge. It will definitely not be the last though. Spirited Away is most definitely my favorite Studio Ghibli movie. It was the first one I watched, and even though I've watched a lot of the other ones, it's
still my favorite.
So next week's video is going to be the next illustration for my Tom to Town series featuring the Cupcakery. I'm also going to be launching my Patreon next week. I'm still working out the details of the Patreon rewards, but one of the first rewards is going to be the finalized line art for the Cupcakery illustration that will be available as a downloadable coloring page. So if you love coloring, know someone who loves to color, or if you're a teacher looking for some cool coloring pages for your classroom, stay tuned for the launch. Speaking of coloring, I also have 2 downloadable Valentines available on my Etsy shop right now. One is a full color version and the other is the line art so you can color it yourself. So be sure to check those out. They're pretty cheap, pretty fun, easy to download. Thank you guys so much for watching and hanging out with me again. I hope you enjoyed this week's scene studies theme. I know I did. It was definitely a challenge. We chewed on and we made it. So if you guys have any suggestions for scenes to paint or themes to explore, let me know down in the comments. Bye guys!